Well, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us for CSR Marketplace Virtual 2026 and for today's session, Design for Efficiency, Deliver More Impact, which is sponsored by our friends at Fidelity Investments. My name is Katie Stearns. I'm the Vice President of Membership and Partnerships at ACCP, and I'm glad you're here. Thanks for taking some time out of your day to join us and get some insights on this great topic. If you don't know ACCP, we are the premier membership organization for corporate social impact practitioners, and all of our programs, including this week's CSR Marketplace Virtual, are designed to advance our mission to share knowledge, foster solutions, and cultivate a community of corporate social impact peers. So we are glad that you're part of that community today. This is one of 8 sessions that we've been hosting this week as part of the CSR Marketplace Virtual. And there are 2 more remaining today. Registration remains open, so we encourage you to check those out. We're also recording all of the sessions, and those will be posted to the ACCP website next week, and then available through the end of the calendar year for your viewing pleasure. Before we get started, I want to highlight some other upcoming ACCP programs. If you happen to be based in Chicago, like me, there is still time to join us for an in-person CSR exchange event next Tuesday, June 23rd. That's just one of the local events that we are hosting this year. We will also be in Seattle, Philadelphia, LA, Minneapolis, New York, DC later this year, so keep an eye out for those. On July 9th, members are invited to join us for a topical member discussion, which will be an insider sneak peek preview of the findings from our annual CSR Insights survey. And then on July 15th, members and non-members alike are welcome to join us for a webcast with the full release of the Insights survey results. If you're curious what ACCP membership is all about, you can join us for a deep dive into the benefits on July 16th. And then don't miss the ACCP conference. It is the event of the year for corporate social impact folks. We'll be in Boston this year, and early bird registration ends next Friday, June 26th. There's much more info about these events and all of our other programs available at accp.org. All right, a few Zoom logistics. We have turned on closed captioning and live transcript today, so if you'd like to see the full transcript, you can navigate down to the bottom of your Zoom screen, look for that CC icon, and click the caret in order to select View Full Transcript. We also encourage you to interact with our speakers and with each other, so please feel free to blow up that chat on Zoom. We also want to hear your questions throughout today's presentation. We'll have some dedicated time at the end of the presentation to dig into these, so please, as they come to you, go ahead and add them to the Q&A function, and we'll circle back to those. With that, it is my pleasure to introduce our speakers for today. We're joined by Maeve Miccio, Head of Philanthropic Consulting at Fidelity Investments, and Jennifer Bahus, Vice President of Philanthropic Consulting at Fidelity Investments. So Maeve, Jennifer, I'm turning it over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Katie. And hi, everyone. Thanks for being with us this afternoon. As Katie mentioned, my name is Maeve, and I lead Philanthropic Consulting at Fidelity, and I'm joined by my colleague, Jen. And our team is really focused on helping our clients achieve greater impact through philanthropy. So we work with companies really across the full spectrum of their CSR and employee engagement programs. Everything from benchmarking and strategy work to nonprofit research, grants administration, all through impact reporting and evaluation. And I have personally been working in this field for almost 20 years now. And one of the things that I have heard from colleagues and friends every single year is that people are being asked to do more with less. And we're thinking about that. And we were also reflecting upon a conversation we had with a client a couple of years ago where they said, hey, can we outsource our whole grant making program to you guys? It's really administratively burdensome. Can you take it on? And we said, yes, but maybe we should start with doing an audit of your process so that we can make it more efficient for anybody involved. And so what we wanted to do today was to kind of bring that line of thinking through to present some ideas on how you can be more efficient in your philanthropic and employee engagement programs. So what we'll be talking about today are approaches to streamlining grant making, matching gifts, volunteering, and reporting. So we'll share some tips as well as some case studies, and we'll have time for Q&A at the end, of course. And our goal today is to be very practical and tactical so that you have a couple of tips that you can kind of take back to your team this week or next and think about implementing them. So let's start off with a poll here. I'd love to hear from you all, kind of what are the areas where you feel like there's the greatest opportunity for streamlining? Maybe that's volunteering, matching gifts. We'll talk about all of this. Maybe it's everything. You just let us know. And if it's other, I'd love to hear from you in the chat or during the Q&A. So go ahead and take a moment to put in your vote there. We'll definitely be talking about all of these. So. Sometimes hard to choose. A lot of options. Okay, great. Yeah, all of the above. No, no surprise there. So we'll talk about that. We'll talk about all these things. We'll also do a deeper dive onto reporting. And again, if you have specific questions, definitely pop them into the Q&A or you can follow up with us after. All right, so when we think about streamlining our programs, we kind of approach it through a couple of different lenses. So the first being aligning effort with impact. And what we mean by that is really taking a step back and understanding what is the intended or desired outcome of this program? What is the strategy? What is the end goal? And what we can do is then, as we think about our process or our program design, ask, is each specific step or component aligned with helping us achieve that end goal, or have we just kind of added it over time? So we'll talk about what that looks like in practice. Next up is simplify, and this is maybe the most obvious, but how can we reduce friction? So when we think about that, we're thinking about things like how many handoffs are there for one particular grant? How many documents are uploaded? How many touches does one kind of matching gift grant get in a process? So we'll be digging into that in terms of specific aspects later. And then finally, scale. So we know that you're all being asked to do more with less. How can we increase our output without increasing our effort? So what are the tools that we can use to be more efficient given the limited time and resources that we all have? And with that, I'll turn it over to Jen to get us started on grant making.
Thanks so much, Maeve. So for those of you whose company actually makes grants to nonprofit organizations, so donations directly to nonprofits, this is an area where a lot of companies feel some tension between rigor and efficiency, right? We all want to do our due diligence, but we also want to make the process as efficient as possible. And what we often see is that a grant making process evolves over time, right? As more people come and leave the company, there are more checks and balances added, sometimes some more questions added to the grant application, more stakeholders added to the process. And before long, we often see that this process becomes more burdensome, maybe than it needs to be, and not just for your team internally, but also for your grantees as well. So if we go back to Maeve's first point or first part of our little process here, aligning effort with impact, when you're thinking about streamlining your grant making, the first thing to think about is the effort that you're putting out there. Is it aligning with what you're trying to achieve? So if you require an application from your grantees, one simple but I think really helpful exercise is to look at every element of the application and ask, does this actually help us make a better decision? And if the answer is yes, great. If the answer is no, it might really be adding friction without adding value. And from there, we'll talk a little bit now about simplification and scale. So where can you eliminate unnecessary forms, as Maeve mentioned? Where can you standardize decision making? Maybe it's as simple as setting up a really simple rubric for decision making. We also encourage organizations, companies to think about the full life cycle of a grant. So as Maeve mentioned, how many times is an application being touched by how many people? And realize that every time there's a handoff, that can introduce delays, complexity, and quite honestly, we've seen it. It can also introduce errors and things getting missed. And then lastly, when we start thinking about scale, as Maeve sort of alluded to, where can technology help? And today, obviously, we're all thinking about AI and where AI can play a role. And can AI or another tool really help, especially with early stage vetting? It might be as simple as a tool that can tell you if an application is complete or if a form is complete. And that could be really useful to save you time and energy at the beginning. One other thing we wanted to call out here is I think many companies often struggle with how to respond to disasters. And this is a great area where engaging a partner can really help with efficiency. Maeve and I worked with a company that was actually really dedicated in responding to disasters that affected their employees and the communities where they lived. But it became really burdensome for them because they were a fairly small company. So we worked with them to identify a nonprofit partner. You might be familiar with the Center for Disaster Philanthropy. And now the company provides a fairly large donation to Center for Disaster Philanthropy every year, knowing that CDP responds to disasters all over the world, really. So the company is doing their part to respond, but really has sort of alleviated all of that administrative and decision-making burden that had been on them. So now let's dive into an example. Maeve and I work with a corporate funder that had built over the years, as I'm sure many of you have, a very robust, we'll say, application process. Lots of questions, multiple forms that were required from their applicants, and a lot of layers of internal review. And I should say, I think for all of these initiatives that we'll be talking about today, the intent was good, right? All good intentions, trying to do their due diligence, but it really had become a burdensome exercise for the staff, the internal team, and the grantees. So we kind of encourage them to step back and ask three key questions. One, are we asking for more information than we really need? And I think most of us can say we get things in that are really never looked at or sort of filed away and that we don't really use. So that's key. Are you asking for information you need? Then, do you have the right people involved in the review process and in decision making? And then lastly, what parts of the process really require internal ownership and what parts might be better outsourced so that staff can focus on higher value work? So as a result, as we went through these questions with them, the company ended up really streamlining the application. To get into a little bit of detail there, they had been requiring from their grantee partners a W-9, an IRS letter of determination, and 990 forms. But to be really frank, these forms, two of them were not necessary at all because the company was utilizing a donor advised fund to make their grant. So if you are familiar with donor advised funds, or even if you're not, the donor advised fund sponsor does a level of diligence on grantees. So the donor advised fund sponsor makes sure the grantee is a 501c3 organization in good standing. And then the donor advised fund is also the one sending the payment out. So, just by those two traits alone, the company really didn't need the letter of determination and didn't need a W-9 from the grantees. So that was pretty easy to eliminate. Then we talked to them about how they were using the 990s that they were collecting. And it turns out they weren't performing any sort of financial analysis on the 990s. They were just kind of saying, okay, yeah, they have a 990, right? So they decided they really didn't need that either. So then we talked a little bit more about the review process, and they clarified roles within that process. They realized that their senior leaders don't need to be looking at everything and that some other folks can just sort of do the initial stages of the vetting. And then we identified areas that could be outsourced, right? So a lot of the work came to us and we helped them with a lot of that because they weren't things that had to be done internally. And so the end result, the outcome, I think was really meaningful. They were able to move a lot faster. They got money out the door faster. their grantees had a much better experience because they weren't spending tons of time uploading forms or forgetting to add something and then having a lot of back and forth. And then certainly they were able to the company was much better able to use their internal resources. And then maybe most importantly, even though all of this process was made more efficient, they really didn't sacrifice any rigor, right? All of the same steps in the due diligence were covered off on, just in a much more efficient way. So Maeve, I'll pass it back over to you.
Great. Thank you, Jen. So next up, we wanted to talk about matching gifts. And I'm sure for many of you that administer matching gifts programs, they can be a little bit of a drag. Definitely heard that before. So we wanted to offer up some ideas on how you could perhaps streamline your program, right? And this first step of really thinking about the purpose of the program, I think we often overlook this with matching gifts. It's kind of one of those programs that companies have for like 20, 30 years, and we just haven't. And we've worked with a number of companies that have really intentionally set up a new program with a purpose in mind. So perhaps, your focus is on offering a best-in-class benefits package. And so that's kind of why you're offering this program. Maybe you're looking for reputational lift in the local communities where you operate. I think it's good to really kind of take a moment to ask, why do we have this matching gifts program? Of all of the benefits that it may enable for us, what's the most important? Because based upon that, you can determine which elements of the program or the process are really supporting that specific goal, as opposed to kind of maybe they were added on, as Jen mentioned, over time, kind of glommed on. So that's something to kind of review your program guidelines and see which of these is in service of the ultimate goal and which is not. Another thing to think about is the level of individual discretion required to administer the program or to comply with the program guidelines. The more individual discretion that's required, the more time, the more room for error, the more room for back and forth communication with employees, etc. So the more we can streamline this and make things kind of straightforward and cut and dry, the easier for the administrator, right? So let's talk about simplification. And I wanted to talk about offline matches. If you're not familiar with an offline matching program, this is where an employee makes a contribution and then they upload a receipt or share a receipt, and then someone verifies it and then can propose a match, a corresponding match to that. I would offer a little bit of a hot take on offline matches and challenge you to think about how much time is being spent to verify offline match receipts in a given year. And what is the rate at which there is an error or a falsification? It's probably very low. And in turn, what is the outcome that would come from that? Likely that, for instance, the food bank got an extra $250. So maybe ask the question, if we're spending 100 hours a year on verifying these matches and the potential risk is an extra couple $100 goes to the food bank, should we maybe re-examine this? What's the risk reward here? So that I'll leave that hot take with you to consider. Next up is the campaigns in terms of frequency and complexity. I know it can really feel like with these campaigns, you never catch your breath because you're prepping for one, you're executing, you're doing the look back at the same time you're prepping for the next one. Are all of them in service of your ultimate goal, and are all of them successful or warranted? Is there a possibility to say, hey, we have 5 campaigns a year, maybe we should really just focus our energy on 2 that are the most meaningful to the employees or that are most aligned with our goals? And then finally, in terms of scale, if you're not already leveraging a technology solution, definitely consider that. There are many available. At Fidelity, we offer Fidelity Workplace Giving. It really automates matching gifts, volunteering, reporting, payment processing, all of that good stuff. This can be a really helpful way to just make it simple for you as well as for your employees. So definitely investigate that if you have not done so already. And I'll turn it over to Jen now to talk about, we'll talk about a case study for matching gifts. Okay, wanted to share this example. This was a client that came to us about 2 years ago, and they initially shared they were going to start up a matching gifts program, and they shared the program guidelines with us. And the way that they initially had it structured was that organizations would only be eligible if they align with their kind of three corporate pillars, their focus areas. And when we talked this through further with them, we uncovered the end goal of the program was to have broad-based employee participation. The way that they had it structured from the get-go was going to be problematic in achieving that goal for a number of reasons. Primarily being that not all of the employees really care about those causes from their personal giving, right? So if one of your focus areas is STEM education, but we know that for your employee population, maybe health related causes are really important, or various, K through 12 other things, it might be challenging to achieve that participation. Additionally, that level of kind of restriction requires a lot of individual discretion. So when we think about if your program, again, focus is STEM education, if you receive a match request for Boys and Girls Club, they definitely have STEM programming, but was this for the STEM programming? Was this for the basketball program? I'm not sure. It requires a lot of individual discretion. So luckily, they were open to our feedback to broaden the eligibility of the program guidelines and allow employees to have a lot more choice and open-ended options. And as a result, they were able to achieve greater participation. They lightened their burden. They didn't have to do as much administrative individual checking and verification. And they also leveraged a technology solution to really make sure that this could run pretty seamlessly, and they had automated processing and automated reporting. So I think they were very happy with the outcome. It saved them time and helped them achieve their goal. Jen?
Great. So now we'll switch gears to volunteering. I'm sure many of you have volunteering programs at your company. And I think one through line that we're seeing so far is a lot of programs tend to expand or increase in complexity over time. And I think that volunteering programs are no different. A lot of times volunteering programs happen because employees get excited about something and everyone wants everyone to be excited. So we don't want to say no. So we allow new programs, new formats, new incentives, new initiatives, all to sort of creep into our overall programming, and all again with really good intentions, right? The idea that we're going to increase engagement, increase our interaction with the community. But what we see is without intentional design, that kind of complexity can actually really dilute participation and dilute impact. So again, the starting point here is aligning effort with impact. So we want to keep programs flexible, that is important, but still consider what is the core goal of the volunteering program. Is it employee engagement, community impact? Is it team cohesion, sort of like team building? Also ask what's working, right? It's a great idea to field a survey to your employees or include a few questions about your programs on your company's annual survey if you do one. And it's a great way to hear and listen and learn what's going well and what isn't. And so once that's clear, the simplify part becomes a little bit easier. You can evaluate whether the number of programs that you're offering and the options that you're offering, is it helping or is it just, sort of creating confusion? You can assess whether every incentive, like t-shirts, or administrative element, is it really necessary? Is it adding to the experience? You still want to offer options and have a flexible program, but to be really honest, that doesn't mean you have to offer every sort of flavor of volunteering program or incentive under the sun. In many cases, we have seen companies that offer fewer, clearer programs actually drive stronger participation because you've got, you can really promote them more easily because there's not as much stuff competing, and you can focus your efforts. And then when it comes to scale, I think especially for large initiatives, if you have sort of signature initiatives, it can be incredibly valuable to bring in partners who are able to help. And that might be organizations out there that sort of help curate large scale volunteering opportunities for companies, or partnering with a nonprofit in your community or where you have offices that are really well positioned to accommodate sort of a group activity, or well positioned to sort of think through how you could do something like a week of service or something like that. So an example of an organization that we work with who really did a great job in streamlining their volunteering program had really developed a wide array of volunteer opportunities, virtual opportunities, in-person, skills-based, dollars for doers, week of service, sort of you can think of it, they were doing it. Each program was really well-intentioned, but together they created this sort of really fragmented offering, and engagement was not where they wanted it to be. It was really spread thin across so many options. So we encourage the company to take a step back. And again, like we've been saying, really focus on and articulate what the purpose of the program was. And for them, the purpose was to build meaningful connections among employees and with their nonprofit partners. So from there, with that sort of North Star, they really were able to streamline. They reduced the number of offerings that they had, and they really simplified program elements and eliminated tracking that wasn't adding value. So now instead of tracking employee hours, they were more focused on number of employees that were engaging, because they were clear that that's what one of their goals was, to get employee engagement. They also created a playbook that made it much easier to execute events consistently and at different sites, so they weren't starting from scratch each time. And they brought in a partner to help them with their week in service, which kind of became one of their signature flagship initiatives. And so what was really cool is the result was not fewer programs, less engagement. Actually, it was more engagement. They had stronger participation, clearer impact, and way less administrative burden. And I think also really importantly to call out is that because they were measuring what truly mattered to their program, they were really able to tell a great story. They kept track of their employee involvement, and they also asked nonprofits that they worked with how well received the programs were and what impact they had. And so they were really able to report in a meaningful way on what mattered to the company.
Great. Thank you, Jen. So we'll turn over to reporting. And this is an area where we want to talk about streamlining, not only for your benefit on the administrative end, but also for the benefit of your nonprofit partners and grantees, right? Because it can require a tremendous amount of time for folks to submit and track and organize all of those reports. And I think one of the helpful kind of framing principles in understanding the end goal is you likely have, the opportunity to present to your executive team maybe once or twice a year, where you're really articulating the value of your community impact or employee engagement programs. Think back to when you've had that opportunity and maybe you get to have one or two slides in the presentation, right? What are those key points that resonate with the executive team or other key stakeholders to say, this is a really great use of our company's resources to be investing in this, right? Because those points are going to be what helps continue the investment in your CSR work, continue to grow your philanthropy, grow your employee engagement. So think about all of the data that you collect and how does that compare to what really moves the needle in terms of solidifying and continuing an investment in your programs? When we think specifically about grantee reports, you're probably, collecting a good amount of information. How are you using it, right? One helpful barometer, I think, is if your company produces an annual CSR or impact report, within the community section, you probably get a couple of pages. I would say go to that and look at what are the data points that made the cut there, because that's a very heavily edited and reviewed document. Are there a couple of key data points in there, or are there also a lot of stories? Like, what is resonating to communicate the value of your impact on an annual basis? I'm sure you're producing many kind of quarterly or monthly dashboards and all of those things. Is there an opportunity to really distill down to what matters for external stakeholders and your highest level of internal stakeholders, right? And then in terms of scale, AI can be a great friend to you here, and we have used it a number of times to help with analysis, synthesis, and summarization. So if you have, let's say, you had a big reporting deadline for your key partners and you have 20 reports that came in, of course, we encourage you to read all of them, but you can get a jump start on, let's say, creating an executive summary of what were the trends, what are the key challenges our community partners are facing? Like what were some of the aggregated impact numbers? So that can really help you kind of get a jump start, as I said, on understanding kind of the information and how you can use it to make decisions moving forward. So for instance, we have found that really understanding trends around challenges faced by the nonprofit organizations can help us reimagine or slightly modify our grant making approach for the next year. So I think AI can be a really useful tool in this way. So let's talk about a client that we worked with that had a pretty robust grant making program and also a pretty robust reporting requirement in place. And they collected, very comprehensive reports from the grantees, and they did so on a fairly regular basis. So for some, it was not only just at the end of the grant period, it would be periodically kind of checking in throughout. And what happened was, in speaking with the contact at the company, she really did not have the bandwidth to read all of this. She was spending a lot of time kind of troubleshooting questions about the reporting. Is this due? Is this the right way to answer this? All of that back and forth, that it kind of took her out of the purpose of the reporting, which is to understand what to do with the information and how to modify your behavior as a result, right? So she reflected back on the impact report on what really mattered most to those key stakeholders, whether it be executives or other kind of external groups, and was able to distill down what are those key metrics that I need to be gathering in the report and shorten the report so that she was collecting only what mattered most. And then also using AI to kind of develop those executive summaries to get a jump start on those quarterly or biannual, annual board meeting reports, whatever the case might be for your organization. And that really helped her better utilize the information that she was gathering. One thing that I'll add here, it's not necessarily reflected in this particular case study, but we've had a lot of conversations with clients related to the threshold for requesting a report. And this kind of goes back to Jen's points earlier on the grant making section. But, I would challenge us to ask, do we really need a report from that $1,000 sponsorship of the Little League team? Like, I don't know. What are we doing with that information? And similarly, if we're asking for a lot of output related data, like number of people reached or, things like that, do we have context enough to know if that's really exciting or, mediocre? Like, how do we know what to do with that information without context? So I think that there's a lot to be gained in terms of efficiency around reporting. So just a couple of key takeaways to summarize what we talked about today. As the adage goes, keep it simple. Always simple is best. We would challenge you to be brutally honest in your assessment of what actually gets used. And then think about the cost per transaction, right? So if you are making a grant, let's say that's $5,000 and it requires an hour of review here, several handoffs, 30 minutes for payment processing. How much does that cost you and is it right size? Can you be more efficient so that you can focus on what really matters? Consider tools that help. We mentioned the matching gifts platform, grant making management systems. You can use AI, as we mentioned. There are a lot of amazing technology tools out there to make your life easier, as well as partners that can lighten your load, whether you're working with an organization that facilitates and curates your week of service or a group like ours that can kind of take on components of your process or help you do an audit. There are a lot of partners out there that are here to help you. So with that, we'll turn to Q&A.
Thanks, Maeve. Thanks, Jen. I think y'all have offered a really powerful reminder about how essential simplicity can be, and it can still be highly impactful. So thank you for that. We do have some questions coming in, and I would invite those of you that are listening in, if you have questions coming to you, please drop them in that Q&A function. But I would love to get started by picking up on a nugget from that last slide you just showed us as you were talking about leveraging tools. feel like every conversation right now is about AI. How are we using it? How can we apply it to this work? And as you said, this is a group of folks who are being constantly asked to do more with less and turning to AI in a lot of cases to boost efficiency and capacity. So, anything you would share with us around specific AI tools that could be useful as folks think about simplifying their reporting, their volunteering, their grant making, all of what you've shared with us today?
Yeah, absolutely. There's one specific tool that's really neat that I would point people toward. It's from the Patrick McGovern Foundation and it's called Grant Guardian. And this specifically relates to grant making. So this is a tool that leverages AI to do the financial health analysis of prospective grantees. So pulls in, you can pull in their 990s and other, related materials, and then it will conduct the analysis and do a really nice write-up for you. And it also allows you to leverage kind of templated indicators for financial health. So it's really, really a nice tool. I would encourage you to check that out. And then other than that, I know a lot of folks on the call probably have access to Copilot, and we're experimenting with Copilot and using that. We're getting better with prompting and finding it can be super helpful with analysis and synthesis. So I would encourage you to make Copilot your friend. And there's a question, restate the grant tool that's called Grant Guardian from the Patrick McGovern Foundation.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, I mean, and I'm probably saying what most of the audience knows because I know we've all sort of dabbled in AI. I'm certainly not an expert, but I think for me and maybe our team is we use AI most confidently in the areas where we know it shines, right? So like doing data analysis is kind of a no-brainer, even if you don't end up using the analysis, but just to get comfortable with it. And so if you've got a bunch of reporting information, it just play around with it and see. We have found it to be extremely helpful with that. At first, and still we check everything, but then you realize the power of it, and it really can take something that used to take many hours, into a few minutes. The other thing that I think is kind of interesting, and I've had, intermittent success with this, but comparing organizations to each other. Maeve, I think you mentioned using AI to pull out trends and information that people send, but also if you're looking at a slate of grantees, asking what differentiates one from the other, or where is one and that kind of thing. I think sort of adds to our thinking and our way of like analyzing things. It's not maybe the final result, but I think it helps give us some different ideas. So again, I'm sure everyone's kind of playing around, but those are some areas where I think that we found it to be really useful.
That's great. Let's dig in even a layer deeper on AI because we've got a question from Jacob. In terms of leveraging AI for grant making, particularly for vetting and evaluating grant making criteria, what thoughts would you offer on managing the balance between simplicity for the grant maker and the reviewer versus the robustness of the review to be able to withstand any audit requirements?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that what I would suggest without understanding like the specifics of a program is making sure that you have a rubric in place to conduct the review. And then maybe there are components of the application that can be run against the rubric or kind of get you a head start on the process, right? So we're definitely suggesting if you're asking a nonprofit to produce the information, like you should be reading it. But when it comes to Jen's point of like comparing it or taking it all and putting it into a summarized table, like that can be really helpful for helping with the review process. So I would encourage you to like develop the criteria set and the rubric and the weighting and all of that on your own, and then use AI to get a jump start on the process. But you have to apply human, discretion to all of this for sure. And also try and control for bias, right?
And I would also just add to that, I think sometimes we rightfully are concerned about audit requirements, but sometimes they're not as stringent as we think. So also getting a really clear sense of what is compliant and what isn't. And sometimes that can be kind of eye-opening, right? So I think being really clear on what might be out of compliance would be really important too.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Thank you. Hopefully that helps, Jacob. And then we've got a question from Adam who says, we see longtime nonprofit partners ask for different kinds of donations, a direct grant, a sponsorship for an event, in-kind equipment. How do you balance the requirements that each of those transactions require while still keeping simplicity in the center?
Yeah, it's a good question and it's a tough one. I don't think we have a silver bullet for that. It would be great if there's some kind of like common app, right? And I know many of the grant making tools have this where once you create the profile, at least that part, you don't have to complete it each time. So then maybe it's like you have your organizational profile and then there's just the specific questions related to that. So my sponsorship is like, how many people are going to be at the event? Like, what's the reputational benefit to our company? And then the more programmatic one has the different programmatic questions, but whatever you can do to save the time in terms of organizational information, the fundamental, the documentation, so that they're really only answering those questions that are pertinent to that specific funding stream. And Jen, I don't know if you have other ideas.
No, I mean, I agree completely. And maybe just to add a finer point to it, I think so having a grants management system or some kind of tool, I think really helps. And then I think one of the things we've seen go, both ways is either having separate grant applications with which can be burdensome. So I think the preferable thing is to have a system that also allows you to kind of have those logic questions or branching questions. So you don't have to have multiple forms that you have to update every time, but you can have one form. A lot of times that is functionality that, well, I think today pretty much that's table stakes with grants management systems. It might require, kind of redoing your applications, but I think that's one of them. And then I think the question went away, but I think the other thing was, the requirements and vetting them. And I think, as Maeve said, just having really clear rubric for each of the different types of donations. I think that also really helps. The other thing I also ask people is a lot of times we'll hear, well, we kind of know what we support or whatever. And then it's like, well, but what happens if you leave or your team leaves or someone else has to step in and do this work? So making sure that the way decisions are made is, kind of documented and there's a framework, I think is really not just more efficient, but also really helpful for sort of the future of the organization.
That's great. I want to squeeze in one more question before we let folks go. We've talked a lot about the systems and the tools, but we know that people are also a big part of this, and plenty of corporate social impact leaders out there are navigating programs or companies that have done things a certain way for years or for decades. So, do you have any advice for folks who might be challenged by getting their colleagues or their leaders to be willing to let go of how something has always been done and instead move in the direction of simplicity?
Yeah, and I think as we were talking, we saw not only people who weren't letting go of how things were done or examples, but also adding to the way things that have been done over time. So it becomes like a bigger and bigger challenge. So I think one really helpful practice to put in place is reviewing your applications, your materials, whatever, at least every year, maybe every cycle, every a couple of years, getting in a habit and a practice of objectively doing that. So it sort of becomes a habit. And then, again, asking this question, what do we need? What do we really need? So if you took all the materials you have today and just started and said, what do we need to make the best decisions? And then applied that to what you're doing. And I think a lot of that is, a little bit of culture, a little bit of getting in the practice of doing it regularly. And then I think we also sometimes hear of people who, a lot of times people administering the grant programs aren't, they have senior leaders above them or whatever, and they don't know how to bring up that thing. I think a great way to say it is I've sort of identified some areas where I think we could maybe be more efficient. Could we have some time to talk about it together? Because I bet other people have ideas too, or something like that. Because I don't know anybody who is not open to the idea of making something more efficient, right? Like that seems to be a pretty universal desire. Maeve, I don't know if you have anything to add.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely tricky. And I would say just like know your audience, right? So if you're talking to, the executive team and you're advocating like, hey, this legacy program maybe needs to, be sunsetted at this point. Maybe a cost benefit analysis is the way that you position it, right? And maybe if it's an employee that's really affected by, well, the matching gifts program is changing and now my church isn't going to get their fund, whatever it is there an alternate you can offer them? No, but we do have the volunteer program. We have dollars for doers. So if you volunteer there, they can, take advantage of this. So it's definitely tricky and people get emotionally attached to this because philanthropy is personal. But I think knowing your audience can really help in the positioning of the message.
A great point.
Great tips and a good reminder that CSR professionals are also in the change management business, trying to bring their companies and their partners along. Well, Maeve, Jen, thank you both for sharing your expertise, your insights. We're really grateful to Fidelity Investments for sponsoring today's session. And we would love feedback from all of you in the audience. So if you would scan the QR code on the screen or click that link in the chat, take a minute or two to answer the 4 questions in our survey. We would love to hear your thoughts. And we hope we'll see you again, either in one of this afternoon's CSR Marketplace virtual sessions or at another of ACCP's upcoming events. So thanks again, Maeve and Jen, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you all
Have a
for the
great
time.
day.